The sinking of the riverboat Sultana. Outside of war, the loss of the riverboat Sultana, with 1,700 lives, remains one of the worst maritime disasters ever. Yet the news made only the newspapers' back pages. More momentous events claimed the headlines that terrible day. In the last days of April 1865, American newspapers were packed with news of two history-making events: the end of the Civil War and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Some journals, nevertheless, did manage to find a little space for the loss of the Mississippi paddle-wheeler Sultana. New York newspapers reported that the steamer had blown a boiler and many lives had been lost. The news scarcely raised an eyebrow, which was understandable, for the nation was sick of reading about death, and death was supposed to be at an end. One of the greatest bloodbaths in the annals of man was finished, a mass madness that had indirectly even taken the life of the beloved statesman Lincoln. Yet the loss of the Sultana has its own place in history, for the massive death toll remains unequalled in freshwater navigation chronicles, almost 200 more than the Titanic. About 2,300 Union soldiers packed the Sultana when she pulled out from the wharf at Vicksburg in Tennessee. No one seemed concerned that she was licensed to carry only 376 people, including the crew. During her voyage upriver, the Sultana pulled into Memphis, allowing the men brief shore leave. When she again got underway, 300 were missing, all too drunk to worry about matters like the sailing time of a paddle-wheeler. The Sultana's voyage ended on the evening of April the 27th, when her ancient boilers, trying to push the overcrowded vessel through oncoming floodwaters, yielded to the enormous pressures built up in them. The resultant explosion killed hundreds. The inferno that followed took more, and the raging flood took the rest. At least 1,700 souls perished with the Sultana. Most of the 2,300 former prisoners of war who packed onto the paddle-wheeler that morning of April 24, 1865, had been captured during the Battle of Gettysburg and had endured months of profound privations in prisons where even the guards were half-starved. Soon after the 1,719-ton Sultana pulled into Vicksburg, the engineer told Captain J.C. Mason that one of the boilers had sprung a leak. Mason ordered repairs, and quickly. It was hard going right from the moment the Sultana set out, for the Mississippi was in heavy flood and had spewed over the banks for miles around. On board the paddle-wheeler, conditions were little better for the passengers than they had been in prison. Still little more than human skeletons, they were crammed in the bilges, packed the living quarters and corridors, and even squatted shoulder to shoulder on the hurricane, lower and boiler decks. There were some civilians aboard, businessmen with their wives and families. The Sultana plugged upstream, a little more than a few feet with each turn of her two side paddles, and with her lower deck almost awash. But the troops were not concerned. They were on their way home. Late on the afternoon of April 26, the Sultana pulled into Memphis, where some of the civilians disembarked. A number of the soldiers walked into town to be greeted by Union sympathizers who showered them with hospitality. While the vessel was discharging and taking on cargo, Captain Mason was told another boiler had sprung a leak. He could only order emergency repairs, as he had no intention of missing his schedule. When the Sultana pulled out at 11:45 p.m., most of the soldiers who had decided to visit the town were missing. They were still staggering about the streets being plied with liquor by the locals. That left 2,000 on board. The Sultana's next scheduled port of call was Cairo, where most of the soldiers would disembark. But now the floodwaters raged with renewed violence. The vessel shuddered from stem to stern as she tried to make headway. Then one of the repaired boilers blew another hole. The reduced pressure slowed the paddles, and the Sultana's speed dropped almost to zero. At 2:30 a.m. she was opposite a group of small islands, and there the old corroded boilers lost the battle with the tremendous steam pressure within them. The fearsome explosion could be heard back in Memphis. Masses of the superstructure above the Sultana's loading deck ceased to be. The crew of the gunboat USS Grosbeak which was tied up at Memphis, heard the frightening detonation and saw each other's silhouette in the glow of the flames. Within minutes the gunboat's lines had been cast off, and she was headed upstream, followed by a small fleet of other river craft. There was mass madness on what remained of the torn, twisted Sultana, screaming women with flames leaping at them as they tumbled up and down the lower deck searching for children, many of whom were already dead. Other passengers and soldiers sleeping at the instant of the explosion were rudely awakened as they were catapulted through the air, surrounded by pieces of machinery, woodwork and flaming debris. One soldier was hurled 200 feet into the air before crashing to the water. He surfaced near a tree trunk and held on until rescued by the grosbeak. Then there was the massive section of afterdeck that was hurled 40 feet. In its flight it carried 8 men who clung on to this precarious refuge as it hit the water, then began floating back towards Memphis. Less than 2 minutes after the explosion, 1,000 men, women and children were already dead, dying or injured. The soldiers perhaps died more easily than the others, for the privations of imprisonment had weakened them and they had no power left to struggle. Yet there was no salvation for those who remained aboard the wrecked Sultana, for now the flames were so fierce that the rescue craft could not approach. Those in the water had 2 hopes: rescue by one of the craft that had sped up from Memphis, or a quick and comparatively easy death. As the paddle wheeler's old timbers burned like paper, it quickly became apparent to those who remained on the hull that they had only 2 alternatives: death by fire or drowning. Another problem was that the rescue boats were scarcely able to manoeuvre in the raging water. Thus they would be unable to rescue those who jumped before the flames could claim them. On board was a number of physically strong civilian males. Senator Snow of Arkansas organised this group into squads, who immobilised the hysterical women and children, strapping life preservers to their bodies and throwing them overboard. The Sultana by this time was one great mass of flame, but there remained a few areas as yet unconsumed. One was the rear bow. The small reserve was packed tight with a writhing mass of people who could not swim, the injured and the dying. Finally, as the flames advanced, they had to go and fell one after another into the flame-illuminated water. Turning in slow circles, the violently dying Sultana was carried downstream with the flood, and as she swung, the deck containing the officers' cabins collapsed at one end. This meant that the broken deck lay at an acute angle, so acute that the men who sought refuge in the cabins slid out and skidded down the ramp thus created into the very heart of the fire. Yet if men were dying quickly on the Sultana's decks, they were dying even more quickly in the water. Few could swim in those days. At the same time, another batch from the boat dived to their deaths into the area of water that had just claimed its victims. Some pushed overboard bales of hay that were carried to feed the hundreds of now dead horses in the riverboat's hold, and tried to use them as life rafts. But so many grasped them that they sank. The same thing happened with doors that had been wrenched from their hinges and flung overboard. Nevertheless, those who remained aboard were too paralysed by fear to take any self-preserving action. They simply fell to their knees and prayed for the deliverance that was to come to only a few. Then the Sultana's towering twin smokestacks, held aloft by a web of steel cables, swayed and crashed into the boat's burning heart, sending up an enormous shower of sparks that blossomed out over the river and countryside. It was almost finished now, but that was when the little miracle happened. The blazing hulk turned gently and ground herself against a small island, where the few survivors helped each other over the sides into shallow water and onto dry land. Just an hour later, the Sultana died. She heaved a little, rolled away from the island, capsized, and disappeared beneath the surface. All that could be seen was a towering column of steam. Patrol and rescue boats were everywhere, but there was little they could do before dawn, and those first shafts of morning light lit up a scene of unparalleled horror. Although the flood had carried hundreds of bodies downstream, the shorelines remained choked with dead and dying. Each morning, for days after the Sultana catastrophe, a large barge set out from Memphis to search for bodies. It has never been possible to assess precisely the Sultana's death toll, simply because no record was kept of the number crammed onto her at Vicksburg. All the authorities could do was count the bodies found. Later add the 300 who died in hospital and guess at the number of corpses never recovered. The total was 1,700.